He won favour with the right of the Tory party, and King George IV was fond, even in awe, of the victorious general. Early on the 9th of January 1828, a note was delivered to Apsley House from the Lord Chancellor. While the Duke was still dressing, the Lord Chancellor himself arrived to sweep him off to Windsor. The King wanted him to form a government.
The Duke accepted the office of Prime Minister. He turned up here at number 10 Downing Street on Copenhagen, the horse he'd ridden at Waterloo. The Duke is unique in being the only professional soldier in modern British history to become Prime Minister. But he admitted, "It is an office for the performance of the duties of which I am not qualified, and they are very disagreeable to me." But responsibility had never, for one moment, frightened him.
I feel that I am capable of doing or acquiring anything I choose. I must work for myself and by myself, and please God, I shall succeed in establishing in the country a strong government, and then I may retire with honour.
His arrogance would make cabinet government difficult, especially when he had to deal with the infighting of his political colleagues. Although his ministers had been scrupulously polite at a dinner Wellington had hosted at Apsley House, it was the courtesy, as one of them put it, of men who had just fought a duel. What's more, most of them already felt that the Duke was domineering.
Thank you very much. Robert, I need to just talk to you for 1 minute. Now, absolutely.
Wellington found the task of leading a cabinet infuriating.
All my time is employed in assuaging what gentlemen call their feelings. One man wants one thing and one another. They agree to what I say in the morning, and in the evening up they start with something which deranges the whole plan. I used to be accustomed to carry on things in a quite different manner. I assembled my officers, laid down my plan, and it was carried into effect.
The Duke threw himself into his new job with fervour and confidence. His great strengths were his legendary attention to detail and his administrative ability. When an official at the Treasury told him that a certain change in his department's accounting methods was impossible, the Duke said, "Never mind. If you cannot accomplish it, I will send you half a dozen pay sergeants who will." But his years as a military commander, surrounded by officers who simply obeyed orders, had made him dangerously authoritarian.
In May 1828, William Huskisson, colonial secretary in the Duke's cabinet, publicly stepped out of line and voted against the party. Now the Duke's autocratic nature was to show itself. When confronted by the whip, Huskisson wrote to the Duke, "I owe it to you to lose no time in affording you an opportunity of placing my office in other hands." In the convoluted etiquette of the time, Huskisson was offering an apology rather than a resignation. Wellington responded with the inflexibility of an officer facing insubordination.
Your letter of 2 this morning, which I received at 10, has surprised me and has given me great concern. I have considered it my duty to lay it before the King.
A friend of Huskisson's called round to number 10 to explain that the letter had been a mistake. Wellington snapped, "There is no mistake, there can be no mistake, there shall be no mistake." And he stepped out for a stroll along Birdcage Walk, just in case Huskisson should call in person.
Within a few days, other members of the cabinet had walked out in sympathy with Huskisson. Wellington had made a crucial mistake. He had failed to read what lay on the other side of the hill. He should have been uniting his party instead of dividing it. Ahead lay one of the most explosive issues of his day. Since the establishment of the Protestant Church in Britain, profound fear and hatred of Roman Catholics was widespread, and discrimination was institutionalized in law.
This Catholic church in London was allowed to exist simply because it was an embassy chapel. The demand to repeal these laws came largely from Ireland, where 90% of the population was Catholic, and the issue fueled violent nationalism. The Duke had heard that he couldn't even rely on the partly Catholic army. Wellington himself came from an Anglo-Irish Protestant family, but his years of campaigning on the continent meant that he wasn't unduly concerned by papism. He recognized that concession was expedient to avoid the risk of civil war in Ireland.
He was desperate to avoid the anarchy and chaos that he so much dreaded. But in much of Britain, anti-Catholicism was seen as patriotic. If Wellington was to improve the lot of Roman Catholics, he would have to do battle with the King, most of the Cabinet, the Church of England, the House of Lords, and the mass of British public opinion. Handling many of the negotiations with the individual parties in secret, Wellington took on the challenge like a military operation. His biggest obstacle was King George IV, whose opposition could block any reform of the anti-Catholic laws. Wellington would need all his diplomatic skills to handle the King's hysterical fury whenever the subject was mentioned. "I verily believed he would go mad," said one courtier. The Duke persisted, listening endlessly to threats of abdication and watching tears slip down the royal cheeks. By March 1829, Wellington and his ministers were prepared to resign if the King would not back down and allow him to introduce the reforms. A friend of the Duke's gives an account of the final meeting. It lasted for 5 tense hours.
The King talked the whole time of his conscience. He would not support the measures. The Duke said he'd go to Parliament and state that, having not been allowed to bring forward the measures, he only waited until a successor was appointed. The King replied he must then try to find other ministers.
Wellington left with his political career apparently in pieces. But less than 2 hours later, the King sent a messenger after the Duke. He'd backed down. Wellington had forced the King's hand. It was a masterful piece of brinkmanship. He felt that the scale of the challenge had been comparable to Waterloo.
In the House of Lords, the Duke made a simple plea, speaking slowly, with no notes, and his arms folded.
I have passed a longer period of my life engaged in war than most men. And if I could avoid even 1 month of civil war, I would sacrifice my life in order to do it.
Getting the bill passed was his supreme political achievement. But the issue split his party, and soon the extreme ultra-Tories were attacking him publicly.
It would lead to one of the most extraordinary and brash acts of any Prime Minister. When the Earl of Winchelsea suggested that Wellington had an insidious design for the introduction of popery into every department of the state, Wellington demanded an apology. Winchelsea refused. Despite being Prime Minister, Wellington called upon him to give that satisfaction for his conduct, which a gentleman has a right to require, and which a gentleman never refuses to give. These were the rules of his class. Wellington met Winchelsea at dawn on Battersea Fields.
Are you ready?
Yes.
Fire!
But Winchelsea's arm remained by his side. So Wellington fired wide. Honour was assuaged. A suitable apology was then accepted.